Thank you all very much. I don't want you to have the impression that we've arrived here as strangers. We know each other so well, Tom and I do, that on these occasions I think we ought to refer to each other as doctor just to give the interview some credibility. I don't know whether that's going to work or not. I first became aware of Tom back in the 60s when he was living in Key West with what you would not describe as a kindergarten group. His friends were his brother-in-law, Jimmy Buffett, Jim Harrison, his great pal, Richard Ford was hanging out down there some, and there were others as well. And they were getting regular attention in Esquire magazine, the kind of wild bunch of Key West. And I kind of had my nose pressed up against the glass of who they were. I was making my way through the stages of broadcast journalists at the time working for NBC. Later, when I thought about it and came to know Tom very well, I have said to him on many occasions, it's just as well we didn't know each other then, because I wouldn't have lived. I could not have survived the existence that I was reading about on those occasions. We're neighbors in Montana, in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense, we're more than neighbors in Montana. We are of the same generation. We have so many of kindred interests and friends, and I am still very much, and I'm not disinclined to say this in front of him, I'm in awe of his literary skills. Tom is committed to the literary life. We had been hunting a couple of years ago, driving back from South Dakota in a snowstorm, and I said, what do we want to do with the rest of our lives? He said, I don't know about you, but I want to be in pursuit of American literature. That's what my life is about. And no one has pursued it more passionately or with more skill than Tom. And that includes not just the collection of short stories that brings us here tonight, but also his nonfiction, The Longest Silence, about fishing, his work with horses. And then, of course, what got him the attention in the first place were his novels, which he wrote in Key West, and he's continued to write in Montana. So we're very lucky to have him on the American literary landscape, and I'm very lucky to have him as a friend, because we both, I think, work on each other as BS detectors. If one of us gets over the line, I can count on Tom pulling my chain. He can count on me pulling his chain. So it's a great pleasure to have him here tonight. I actually thought about opening, Thomas, with a line that I heard a long time ago. It is said that when Deborah Winger first was making a film with Robert Redford, and they arrived on the set the first day, she allegedly said to him, okay, white meat, show me what you've got. And I thought that might be an opening here tonight, but let's leave it to Deborah Winger. This is a collection of short stories, which has become your signature in many ways. A friend of mine at the New Yorker said, most writers hope to get one or maybe two short stories into the book in their lifetime. You're now there on a very regular and welcome basis. When did you make the turn to finding, for the satisfaction that you obviously get from it, and the voice that you bring to short stories?
Well, my first inclination was to... Yeah, I'll use yours. I really came here to town because I felt that as a literary fiction writer, I could sort of make Tom a bit better known here in New York. I think that seeing Haruki Murakami on the pages of the New Yorker every other week, I thought we've got to, give him a little bit of a little competition. So I really, honestly, at some point or another, felt that I had learned enough about writing novels that I could really try to write short stories, which in some ways I found harder to do than writing novels. There's an old definition of the novel, which is that it's a document of some length with something wrong with it. Short stories seem to be kind of intolerant of longueurs, as the French say. We really have to, sort of have a energy commitment to everything that happens in a short story. You don't always succeed at that, but there's so many good short story writers around now that it's always possible to look around the room and look at David Means or Donald Antrim or, the greats like Alice Munro and so on, and feel energized about trying to write better than you have been writing. And then the other huge factor for me was that the fiction editor at the New Yorker liked what I was doing, and she saw what I did well, and she was very suspicious of what I did poorly. And she had a sharper eye about that than I had about my own work. So I felt in Deborah Treisman's hands a kind of scrutiny over my practices that gave me a little bit of liberty as I wrote that maybe I hadn't had before. So that's kind of what led me to the short story. And then I'm starting a novel right now. I grew up in a kind of dysfunctional family, and I have a lot of firewalls around aspects of my earlier life, and it wasn't until my 70s that I was prepared to look into that portion of my existence and try to understand it. A friend of mine and I were talking recently about a problem I think nearly everyone has, which is you spend a huge amount of your life trying to understand your parents. If any of you have siblings, then you have allies in trying to figure your parents out. But it's a kind of a lifelong problem. I don't know anybody who's quite gotten to the bottom of it. There's a sort of time to try. As they say in rodeo, there's a time to try and a time to fly, and a smart bird knows why. I mean, at some point or another you say, well, you know, they've been gone for a long time. I think it's time to release them. I've never had that luck. I'm still trying to understand my parents, and perhaps some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. So that's what I'm doing next. I want to attack it in various ways, maybe through a series of short stories, but it always has to do with something that seems to move you at a very deep level, and that's what energizes the project.
You are a very active Westerner, not just as a writer, but as you mentioned, you've been in rodeo. You're a great cutter. That's a particular kind of horseback riding, as you know. I think he's the only writer, I'm sure he's the only writer in the Cowboy Cutting Hall of Fame that is the most skilled riding that you can do. And Tom and Lori, who is here tonight, are both highly skilled at that. He's a great outdoorsman, great angler, hunter, poaches my ground whenever I come back to New York, whenever he can. And a bon vivant in the outdoor set. Tell us how and where you write, and when you get up in the morning, how you go to work.
Okay, you're assuming I do a little work. Does this work? Yes. Yeah. You know, years ago I saw a picture of Walker Percy working in bed. And for some reason I thought, boy, that guy's really onto something. And I have a friend who's a marvelous writer, Miley Malloy, who publishes in the New Yorker. She's from Montana. And I said, you know, I've just discovered this working in bed thing. And I feel a little bit guilty about it. And she said, are you kidding? The reason we got these jobs is so we wouldn't have to get out of bed. But I have a new sort of system, actually. And you know, all of us, the older you get, the more complicated your life is, and you have children and various other hostages to fortune. And so kind of beating the gathering storm in your head so that you can write is one of the tricks. And lately what I've been doing is getting up, making a cup of coffee, and going straight back to bed before I think about anything else. And in writing, and usually you can get, you know, maybe a couple of hours in before you start thinking about other things that you're supposed to do. But having that clean slate in the morning is really priceless. I remember Ray Bradbury, of all people, said that, you know, it's even better to start writing before you're really awake yet. And there's a sort of alpha wave process that's going on that triggers a lot of things in memory and stuff like that it actually kind of works. I have found that if I wait too long, then I'm thinking about everything but what I'm concerned about in my writing. And so it's a matter of playing beat the clock in the morning. And then if you're excited and the project has a kind of gestalt of its own, goes on to the point where it has its own energy and can kind of ignite you, then you can turn back into it at any time of the day. I don't have very regular writing habits anymore. And one of the things I regret when I was younger is that's all I did. I just would get up, I'd get 2 or 3 productive hours in, and then I would sit there till sundown. And I did that for 20 years. And I wish I hadn't wasted time like that. I could have gone on doing something else.
Describe where you write. Where do you go to write it?
In bed. I have a great office overlooking the river that both of us live on. it's it's such a pleasant place. It's hard to discipline yourself in there. It's a great place to look out the window and a great place to listen to the river. And it has a kind of an interior room, and when I really get going, I go in there and I can't see anything in there. Raymond Chandler had a system of writing. He had a room that had nothing in it except a desk and a chair, and he had some hours that he'd go in there, and it was not, he made a deal with himself. You don't have to write, but you can't do anything else in here. That would really kind of bring you to the task. And now we all have laptops with wireless links to the outer world, and they're an unbelievable challenge to getting any kind of work done. And I'm a victim of it as well as anybody else. I get up and read the newspapers, and I try to read, and then I write, and then I think something, and then isn't it great to have Google? I can look this up, and then we're off to the races.
You write about the West, about the American West. And my own very strong impression is, in living in both places, there is so little understanding on this side of the Hudson of what goes on the other side of the Hudson, and especially deep in the American West, where you live full-time and where I live part-time, and kind of where I grew up as well. What kind of reaction do you get from people back here about the characters that they read about in your stories? And then I want to get to something else as well, and about the differences between their lives and what they're reading about in yours.
Well, I think that one of the things about, I haven't always lived in the West, but it's getting on toward 50 years, so it's the only information I have at my fingertips. The first thing about life where I live is, I'm reminded of something Wallace Stegner said to me years ago, and he said there's a special quality that people have when they have the dignity of scarcity. If you read Faulkner, you can tell that he knew his characters or his prototypes or his archetypes, in 360 degrees, because there are so few of them and you saw them in such depth. And that's the way we not only see the people that we know and write about, but that's the way they see us. They know when, on my ranch, they know usually when the lights go on in the morning. Everybody in the community knows. So you have no secrets, and they have no secrets either. And that's not always what you want, but it kind of works for writing. And where we live now is filled with contradictions. We have drug problems. We have the Old West. We have the New West. Fewer Westerners are ranchers than people. 2% of Montanans are ranchers. One of my frustrations in writing about the West is that the people I knew and saw never seemed to appear in what the Chamber of Commerce considers Montana literature. So I wanted to air them out a bit, and they're really the only people I knew much about. I know a certain number of picturesque Westerners, but I know lots and lots of people who live their lives like the rest of us do. But there still is residue of something that's quite exceptional there. My FedEx man is the great-grandson of Custer's chief of scouts, who was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn. That's kind of not like it is everywhere else. But somebody writing about the parts of the country, our county never passed the population density that would have rendered the frontier over. And somebody said, well, what holds these communities together? And they said, well, really, it's the little brown UPS truck. So,
I'm going to read something that I think encapsulates many of the themes that we find in your stories. This is called A Long View to the West. The wind funneled down the river valley between the two mountain ranges, picking up speed where the interstate hit its first long straightaway in 30 miles. Clay's car was right on the frontage road where land was cheap, and the wind made its uninterrupted rush, whatever the season of the year. Before winter had quite arrived to thicken his blood, while the cattle trucks were still throwing up whirlwinds of cottonwood leaves, the wait between customers seemed endless. He couldn't even listen to the radio anymore. In the snowy dead of winter, it was easier somehow. Now, face close to the windows and one hand leaning against the recycled acoustic tile that lined the walls, he stared down at the roofs and hoods of the used vehicles in search of a human form, when just before lunch, a rancher came in, about a 5-year-old 3/4-ton Dodge that Clay had sold him. In that description, you give us the topography of the land, the weather and the effect of it on the land. You have a character who is slightly unmoored from life, and he's talking about the land as well. It seems to me that in all of your stories about the West, we find those familiar marks. In your stories about the West, there's always something about the land, getting a good piece of land, or getting a poor piece of land for that matter, and looking kind of over the horizon for some hope. Am I wrong in that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, one of the conditions of the West is, as the demographers say, is a tremendously low rate of what they call persistence. People tend to move on. They arrive and they depart. They don't really generally stay very long. And then there's what Stegner used to call stickers, people who drift in and never go on. And so you have this kind of striated society, the people who were born and raised there, the Indians, the people who came and stayed, the people who were there, and you can tell right away they're not going to be there for long. So those are kind of the conditions of the society we live in, and it's a little bit hard to grasp that. It's not like Yoknapatawpha, where they've been there since the Civil War and are never going anywhere. What was the question, anyway? I'm just
Was I wrong thematically in the kinds of issues that you deal with the land, the unmoored people, and the impact of weather across that topography as well? And because we live close to it, and others don't have an appreciation unless they're there somehow.
It's an impinging reality in that you either feel that you're elevated by these tremendous landscapes, or the feeling that the land really doesn't care about you. It's going to go on without you, and then it has. I know a lot of people feel in effect trivialized by the grandeur of the surroundings. And somebody said to me once, nature is a wonderful thing, but it makes its point rather quickly. I don't think that's really the case, but it is very nice to know that it's not entirely a human universe, and that we need to negotiate our relationship to the earth and stop thinking only in terms of how it can be transformed to our use, because it is in many ways kind of indifferent to us. The greatest biomass on Earth are insects, so they're going to be fine even when we're gone.
Where do you get your ideas? Just driving through the West, reading the local newspapers, talking to your friends?
Yep, a lot of that, or just peculiar things. I was thinking one of my favorite books of all time is Saul Bellows' Augie March, and Saul Bellow was living in Paris and feeling kind of footloose and not really knowing what his identity was as a writer. And he saw a sort of rainbow reflection in a mud puddle, and it all came to him. And he went home and wrote Augie March, which was, for my generation, a book that had the same transformative power as Huckleberry Finn had for an earlier generation.
How do the people in the West feel about your books?
Well, you can very easily feel yourself to be a stateless person in that sense, because the traditional view of Western literature, which is enforced really, is that it really should stick to these sort of kabuki-like themes of the Old West, the settlers, the homesteaders, the Indian fighters, the Indians. And that really, even Stegner said that. He said that this is a literature which has been backward-looking for too long. Most of the kind of traditional Western writers, like Stegner, A.B. Guthrie, and so on, are really kind of amateur historians. And they're for some reason reluctant to talk about how people actually really live today in a place like Montana, which is not all that different in some ways than people live anywhere else.
What is it about Montana? You, Harrison, Carl Hyacin, any number of others who have settled there. McKibben, who's writing about the environment, nature. A lot of people have gravitated to Montana to write not just fiction, but to write about the culture and try to explain it as well, and the elements of that culture which make it unique.
Well, Montana is very different from its neighboring states. By comparison, places like Idaho and Wyoming, the population seems to have been raised in a petri dish. Their uniformity of those populations is, to me, kind of startling. But Montana has always been a very diverse place because of its mining history, its railroading history. There's an extraordinary ethnic diversity in Montana for a rural state. It's also been very aggressive about education. The University of Montana has more Rhodes Scholars per capita than any educational institute in the country. Have the second highest literacy rates in the schools, and there's no money in our school system. It's probably one of the last strongholds of the two-parent household. And it's a place that feels fairly welcoming to people who have odd jobs like writing fiction or writing nonfiction or making films or whatever. It's not at all like the surrounding states. It's just had a different history. You feel, I can remember moving there in the 60s, I didn't feel alienated even at the very beginning. There were always sympathetic people around, book readers and amateur poets and painters. The place is full of painters and some very good painters. So I think that is why it seemed inviting. It still seems inviting to a lot of other people.
You've lived there for more than 50 years.
It's almost 50, yeah.
Almost 50 years at this point. Lori is there as well.
Yeah.
When will they ever accept you as a Montanan?
Well, probably never, it's funny, though, my children are all native Montanans, and if I remember asking them, what do you think, when I say, what is a native Montanan, they said, it's a loudmouth. Then I said, what do you mean by that? It says, well, anybody that would say that about themselves must be a loudmouth. Although I remember one time I wanted to go down to Florida for Christmas, and I said to my kids, I said, let's go to Florida. No, we don't want to go to Florida. I said, it's Christmas, it's warm down there, let's go down to Florida. They said, you don't understand, Dad, we're from here. So anyway, it's an issue, and it's peculiarly a part of life there. I mean, if I had moved 50 years ago to Indiana, nobody would be saying, when are you going to really feel like a real Indianan? Because we have still this kind of psychological frontier condition where people are still trying to claim the land. And this claiming goes on the same basis as mining or water rights claims. It's prior appropriation. And so that's, people really count the days. You've been there. I mean, I hardly dare show my face to people who've been there for 51 years, because everybody's counting.
Let's get some questions from the audience if we can. Do we have microphones or not, Michael?
There should be one here.
What, mine?
Do you want to use
I think it might be under you.
Do you want to use our microphones for the audience? How do you want to do
Yeah, I
it?
got it.
Okay. Raise your hand and they'll find you. And speak up, because both of us at this advanced age
I don't want to belabor the
are all
point,
but deaf.
but about being from there. In Maine, of course, what they say is, not from here.
Not from, yeah, right.
Not from here.
Right.
And I'm thinking that in Montana, that's almost 50 years, you're still culturally not from there.
Well, I think that's probably right, and it doesn't really matter to me very much. I mean, I have enough trouble with my children and my work and my immediate life, so it's not something I really brood about, but it is one of those, it is an issue, I think, for some people. I would hate to think, I'd love not being the person who's so unachieved that really was the biggest thing they could say about themselves. I mean, it's a little bit, it's like a blessed nativity or something. What is this all about? I don't know.
We have a question in the back.
Hey, Tom. I see that you dedicated this in memory of Barry Hannah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's so much to say about Barry. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to single him out in this case is, he was just such a great and original writer, and I don't think he was sufficiently appreciated when he was alive. We were good friends for a long time, and then he resettled kind of in Oxford. He was in Montana for quite a while, and then I'm married to a Mississippi native, and so we had reason to go back and forth to the south, and I'd see Barry down there. But Barry did things with language, syntax, whatever, that are still so fresh that I can always look back into his best work and see how high the bar had been raised. He's kind of being discovered now, which is sort of a tradition in American letters, this sort of post-mortem discovery. As somebody claimed Robert Lowell said when John Berryman committed suicide, "Great move, John."
By the way, Tom is getting ready to go to Mississippi, to Ole Miss, Oxford, which is one of the, speaking of Barry, when he died, the town was in mourning in Oxford, because it is, for all of its troubled history, it's one of the great literary capitals of America these days.
It is.
I mean, there are three bookstores on the main square, and everyone, if you go to a dinner party, however small or large down there, they immediately plunge into these spirited discussions about literature, American literature, and a lot of it, not just all of it, Southern as well. So it is one of those places that I've gotten to be very attached to, and you're going back down there to do some readings, I think, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. That one's a place that's really infested with writers. It kind of reminds me of somebody said about Montana that no matter where you are in Montana, if you throw a rock, you'll hit a writer. But that's true in Oxford, too. And I mean, I like that. I mean, I like talking about writing, and I like seeing other writers.
They have that same sort of sense of place. I mean, writers like Larry Brown and Barry Hanna.
Right.
You get that heavy Oxford
Right.
or Mississippi feel.
Right.
Like the way you're talking about. You know.
Well, they even had it more, I think. You know, they had such a depth of connection to the place. And they, you know, frankly, the South has a deeper history, really. I mean, if the Old West really should be Indians. I mean, it's really it only has a century of Anglo occupation. So it's only recently that we started thinking of Indians as people, because formerly they'd say, well, there wasn't anybody here until the 1880s. I mean, that was a common remark. You know, my parents immigrated here in the 1880s, and there wasn't anybody here. You know, full of Indians. What's yeah, right. Are you an Indian?
Yeah.
Oh, attaboy. What tribe?
Lakota Sioux?
Oh, are you really?
Yeah, half.
Oh, Standing Rock?
Yes, actually 48.
Oh, I'll be darned. Well, here's your fellow Dakotan here.
Tom and I had a Native American friend, writer, and was underappreciated. We always.
Oh gosh, yeah.
A man by the name of James Welsh, and I'll tell you a quick story about him. In the early 1950s, I was living in a construction town on the Missouri River in South Dakota, and this Indian family moved into town because the father was a highly skilled welder, an X-ray welder. And it was a big paying job on the construction of the dam there, and he had these two sons, and I've often told Tom that one of them was my classmate and became quickly my friend. His name was James Welsh. He was the first Indian I ever knew who wore penny loafers. And having grown up in South Dakota, I just assumed all Indians were Sioux. And I said something, you know, in my kind of, wasn't bigoted, but it was my narrow caste white boy attitude. And I said something about you Sioux, and he said, I'm not Sioux. He said, I'm Gros Ventre and Blackfoot. I'd never heard anybody talk that way before. Jim did. And then they moved on because the dam was being completed, and his father moved on to someplace else. And I remembered him a lot, and I wondered whatever happened to him. One day I picked up the Sunday New York Times. We were living in Washington, and on the front page of the New York Times book review section was given over to what they described as a flawless first novel, James Welsh. And I said to Meredith, it's got to be my friend. She said, not possible. Some kid from South Dakota writes this stunning novel. It was him. And then he went on to write a lot of poetry and other novels as well. And Tom wrote a beautiful essay about, was it Fool's Crow?
Fool's Crow, yeah.
Fool's Crow. He was an extraordinarily gifted writer. And I later, when we reconnected, I said, how did you get to be a writer? And he said, you know, it was always in me, and I was not a very good student, but I got a job as a fire watcher one summer. I stood in a tower in the National Forest. I didn't have anything to do except write. And he said, that's when I found my way into writing. So there are those out there, you know, below the surface, so to speak, these gifted writers who represent so many of the cultures. We lost them, what, 8, 9 years ago now.
Fabulous ceremony. Remember they had the drummers come over from the Blackfeet Reservation?
Yeah, it was very touching, and there are very, very few of those. So there are more Western writers, not just the Anglos who came, or the Lower Anglos Wilders, or the Woolly-Cathers, but there are contemporary writers as well who are out there doing a lot of important things. More questions?
Please read James Welch. Anybody of you don't know his work. I mean, you'll send me thank you notes if you do. But Death of Jim Loney, I think, is one that you might start with. He's just really a great American writer. And they're now in the Penguin American Classics series, so they're easily obtained. Yes?
Okay.
She's reading the question. No.
I was looking at hubcaps and your depiction of the parents having cocktails.
Yes, cocktails.
And
like cocktails.
It seemed to have a real great tone to it. But I wonder if that is the same group that was the greatest generation, and if you all talk about what made that generation of parents behave that way, and was it... Do you have that conversation with each other?
I don't think we have yet in exactly that form, but I do remember I went back to my hometown for the first time for about at least 40 years. Jim Harrison and Richard Ford and I all went to the same college, and we went back for an event, and I took a couple of days to go to my hometown. I saw my old friends, and I said, what do you really remember? He said, about our parents in those days. He said, well, they were always kind of shit-faced. Do you remember that? And it was kind of part of it. They would go, they go to the Saturday musicale, or they go to their book club, and the mothers would come out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd be kind of in the bag. And it was that post-World War II thing. It was such a relief that the war was over. That a lot of them had grown up in the Depression and had a vision of the good life that kind of blew up in their faces over time.
I actually have run across a number of them. A lot of them were not published writers, so to speak, but they've written me these beautiful personal recollections and essays of what they went through, because it was the knothole unlike any other that they went through in their lives, and that's why they didn't talk about it a lot. But on the other hand, we were talking backstage, there were writers like Paul Fussell, who was in the war and wrote beautifully about it. And William Manchester wrote an astonishing account of the first kill that he made as a Marine. He was in a unit that was made up mostly of people like him. They were not hardcore warrior types. And the fear that he conveyed and the remorse that he had was a very small book about his first encounter with it. And Meacham and I were talking about it recently, and John said, I think it's in some ways one of the best things he'd ever done, and the most vivid account about what it's like to take somebody's life that he wrote about, and how utterly terrified he was by what he'd gone through. And when I started writing the Great, I thought about Mailer, and I thought about Jones and those guys who had, made their bones writing about it. But there are all these others out there in the literary landscape as well who had written, if not books about it, had written other accounts about it as well that were so vivid. But it was just too hard for them to write about in many instances. They just didn't want to go back there.
I think one of the things that the Greatest Generation did was it let the air out of a lot of private secrecy about the war. One thing I really remember, and I'm old enough to remember this, were sort of family parties, gatherings. A lot of people would have these weekend parties, Saturday night parties at their houses, and the men who'd been in World War II would all slip off. And there was it was a sort of synonym for boredom. They'd say, "What are they doing?" War stories. And they were quite covert about it. It's like nobody really wanted to hear their stories, so they'd go off into a corner and tell them to each other. And I think there was a huge amount of this allowed you and Random House to coin money for 3 years. But
well, one of the things,
it was you let so much air out of a sort of a national secret. I'm serious. I think there were a lot. Culturally, somebody needed to express what these people had been through, and it was a hydrogen bomb when you did it.
A man just died with the 82nd Airborne in Normandy. Tom Blakey was his name. I met him at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And he was a hard case. He grew up in Texas, 16 years old, always wanted to jump out of an airplane, so he volunteered at an early age for the 82nd Airborne, landed on D-Day, jumped in on D-Day, and was immediately in a firefight in which he killed his first German. Killed a lot after that. But he could still see the guy flying up in the air as they were coming at him on a bridge. And he couldn't get rid of it. He didn't tell anybody. He called it the boy in my head. And he just began to reveal that to me in the last year or so. He came back. He was very inventive in the oil patch. He developed a filming process that they would drop down through the drill hole so they could see the sediment, how the differences were, and he made a lot of money. And he was also irascible. He was hard on his family, he was hard on people around him, he yelled at people, he swore a lot. And then his wife died, he went to work at the World War II Museum as a museum guide. And after about 2 months there, his children said to him, "You've changed. You're a different person." And he suddenly realized he didn't have the boy in his head anymore. All those years he'd had this guy dying in his head. And he said, "The reason I didn't have the boy in my head is that I was working at the museum and I was telling people why we did what we did and how important it was that we were bringing down Nazi Germany." And he said, that was my catharsis. So how many stories are there like that out there, where these people bring these demons back and have to live with them in some fashion? And some of them have the capacity to write about that, and in that way, it was a catharsis for him. Tom just worked his way out of it. So, and I thought about how many people there must have been just like that. When I would talk to veterans about PTSD, they didn't know what that phrase was. It was called battle fatigue in those days, and they really didn't want to acknowledge that they had it. So they would wrap themselves in their sheets and lie on the floor, and their wives would get down on the floor with them for months at a time, and they'd sleep on the floor together, and they'd thrash around. And then finally they worked their way out. So it was a trauma, the likes of which we're still working our way through, quite honestly.
When I was writing Driving on the Rim, I needed to know something about the Battle of the Bulge, and there was a tanker living over in Livingston, Montana, who had been in the Battle of the Bulge. So I went over to see him 3 or 4 times. Just recently died. And he told me tank stories. And he had a friend who was coming over one day that I was going to interview him, and he said, "This guy's kind of off his rocker, but he's not a bad guy, but he blows his stack over nothing." So I said, "Okay." So this guy came in, and sure enough, anything that irritated him, the guy blew sky high. And so after, when he left, I said, "What was the matter with that guy? I mean, he's really not normal." And he said, "Well, we were in Belgium together, and he said, we thought we were in an area that had been cleared out ahead of us. We were walking through a big meadow. He said a German Tiger tank came out of the woods and completely freaked him out. He's never recovered. He was fired by the post office because he couldn't contain his temper, and he said he's been suffering for 50 years.
I just went back to the Battle of the Bulge for the 70th anniversary, and I went out in the Ardennes forest, and the foxholes are still there. There were 80,000 Americans and 200,000 Germans coming after them all day, every day for 3 weeks. In the middle of the winter, they had no winter clothing like we now know, and they prevailed. But the trauma of that, and there were 30 veterans there. None of them wanted to talk about it, but I would still make a squadron out of them and send them to war. They were still as anybody I've ever met in my life. The oldest was 96, the youngest was 89. And we were there where there was a heavy snowstorm, it was cold, so we had some appreciation. But I also had layers of Patagonia on, I was getting on a bus to get out of there, so, it wasn't nearly the same.
When Tom got back from the D-Day thing, you may not even remember this, years ago, they're standing under one of these cliffs that the guys landed on, the Marines, I guess, or infantry. And there are these old-time guys in blazers and all dressed up for this revisit. And this little short guy from New York, little Italian guy, is looking up at the cliff. He's about 85 years old. He keeps looking up the cliff. And he turned to Tom, I don't know if you remember this, and he said, "Will somebody please tell me how we did this?"
Yeah, right, exactly. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What are you reading, both of you?
What are we reading?
What other authors are you reading?
Well, I've had an unusual experience. I was diagnosed with cancer almost 2 years ago now, and there were a lot of changes in my life as a result of that. I was blindsided by it. So an odd set of circumstances, I developed new pen pals because one of the books that I read was Donald Hall's account of his wife's death from leukemia. And then I was asked to read at the Lincoln Center some poetry, including a poem by him, about his wife, after she was gone, going to the garden and walking through the rows of Barclay and other things that she planted, and the operative phrase was, "Let it go, let it go." And I was so moved by that poem, and then by his account of his wife's death, when she died and how she died. It was so journalistic in a way. So I wrote to him. And then I got this wonderful letter back from him, and then it started this exchange. Tom has been one of the recipients of a book that he's written called Essays After 80. He is the original curmudgeon. I mean, he's a beautiful writer and a wild-eyed, old-fashioned liberal, taking no prisoners wherever he goes. That, in turn, led to a relationship with Ann Patchett, who I knew only as a very successful novelist. But we were both, through an odd set of circumstances, I don't know how many of you saw this. When Stephen Colbert had his final program, he brought in the damnedest collection of people I've ever been with in my life. I mean, I was in an a cappella group with Yo-Yo Ma, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and I can't tell you who else. It was, and I looked at a picture the other day. There was Willie Nelson standing in the background, Charlie Rose. It was an enormous collection. Ann Patchett, who I'd never met, came over and sat down next to me and said, "I hear that you're quite taken with Donald Hall." And I said, "How did you know that?" She said, "One of my friends told me. I'm a huge fan of Donald Hall's, his short stories and his poetry and everything." That has started my new pen pal relationship with Ann Patchett. That was the only night I met her. And so we're now trading books back and forth, and great. I'm sending her Jim Walsh's book, the first one, Winter in the Blood. Right. I just sent it off to her. I'd asked, there's a longer story attached to this. So it has been, and I'm going to be okay, by the way. I'm in remission, and I'm going to be all right. But the point is that this is something that was utterly unexpected that grew out of this. I've always been literary minded, and I read a lot, and I have a kind of ecumenical taste in books, although I have not been reading much fiction recently, and I told that to Anne, and then she sent me one of her books, and it's dazzling. I mean, her use of language and scenes and characters. So that was something that was wholly unexpected, quite honestly.
I live, by the way, 2 blocks from Ann Patchett's bookstore.
Oh, you do? In Nashville?
2 blocks from her bookstore.
Oh, is that right?
I know her, and she's a gem.
Well, it's been something I never would have anticipated at this stage in my life. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are writers like Tom and others, and they're kind of my closest circle of friends. In journalism, I'm in the broadcasting end of it, but a lot of my friends were writers like David Remnick, who is Tom's editor at The New Yorker, and others. But they're journalistic, and I am inclined mostly to nonfiction, because that's just my big interest. Tom was talking earlier about people who had memories. Rick Atkinson, who's written the trilogy of World War II, the American historian. If you pick up any of his books, they are laced with these beautiful passages from men writing home. And he's gotten these letters and writing about what it was like in North Africa or on D-Day or whatever. And so his works are more than history. They're a literary account of what people were feeling. So that all plays into it. We're kind of wandering so far here, but that's how.
Neither of us have read the most successful book of recent years, 50 Shades of Grey. I got it in galleys this last year, a book that I didn't think I was going to like, and then I read it, and hi, Nick, there's Nick Lyons. The book seemed to be so special, so good, but I thought this will never have much of a readership. But anyway, I finally read it, and it was terrific, and it's now on the bestseller list. It's a book called H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, and it's really good. We're talking about books we've read recently. Was that kind of the question? The other one I read that really fascinated me is because I used to be a big drunk back in the 70s. I read this book called The Trip to Echo Springs by a British writer. I've kind of forgotten her name now. Laird, I think is her last name. It's about four of the 6 American Nobel Prize winners in literature who drank themselves to death. So she was kind of interested in that. So she wrote a book focusing on these 4 lives, not the ones that necessarily died of it, but it was Raymond Carver, Tennessee Williams, John Berryman, and John Cheever. And it's the form of a train trip around North America, a country she didn't know an area she didn't know very much. She visited all these little places, the places where they were institutionalized, the places where they'd had crises, the places where Zelda Fitzgerald burned alive. I mean, she was dressed, the glamour girl of the 20s, dressed in hand-me-down clothes in a mental institution for 15 years, goes up in flames with 7 roommates. I mean, these incredibly numinous sights of kind of catastrophe that, sort of gave some traction to the idea that's often repeated that writing is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world because of the capacity for spectacular self-sabotage exhibited by most American writers. So, I mean, for so many of them it ended badly, but she made such a great book about it. It's a line from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. You remember Brick would always say, bad times with Big Daddy, I'm going to take a little trip to Echo Springs, which was a trip to the bar. So anyway, I recommend it. It's very well reviewed, and it's really a good book.
Maybe the best phrase ever written about rodeo was written by Annie Proulx, and it was about a young bull rider who was having a hard time of it. And he goes in at the end of the rodeo into the locker room, and there's an old bull rider. I was just saying that, talking about the West, one of the best lines I ever read about rodeo was by Annie Proulx, and I remember the particular story, the name of it, but it was about an old and a young bull rider. That's the hardest thing in rodeo. And the young rider was struggling to make his name in bull riding, and there was an old rider who'd been at it a long time. And he goes, and she vividly describes the end of the rodeo, and they're both really beat up. And they go into the men's locker room, and it's bare bones. It's peeling paint on the walls and one shower head. And the old guy is standing with his head against the wall. He doesn't even look at the kid coming in. He just knows he's there. And he says, "It's a bone game, kid. It's a bone game." And I think that's the best summary of bull riding you can possibly imagine. So it's that economy of language that goes with the West.
Right.
Mostly she is exhilarating. Sometimes she doesn't make it, in my judgment. But she's a good example of somebody who gives you that flavor. Other questions?
I was going to say one thing about that. Leslie Fiedler wrote a book years ago called No and Thunder, and he talks about, he has a chapter called The Montana Face, and he had a sort of a sardonic view of life in the West. He taught at the University of Montana, and he brought great people out there. He had Faulkner come out and read to his writing class. But there's a kind of version of the West which is very non-communicative. And he said, the one thing about the Montana face, and he said this was in the 50s, he said, you can tell that it's never had an expression. And we're mentioning Annie Proulx. A few years ago I taught at the University of Wyoming, and one of the things I noticed, this is about the insider-outsider thing, the locals were furious about Annie Proulx. And I think she wrote a great book, and I think she's a great writer. But they said, what business does she have coming here from Connecticut and stealing our stories? So there's still a lot of that. That's a lot of claiming.
That is an issue out there. I mean, I learned early on, I grew up in South Dakota. I don't go back and write about it or do any reports about it anymore. It just is, the penalty is too great, frankly.
Right.
Suddenly the letters, the editors are there, and they're taking me apart. And it's just,
you can't say anything. I mean, if Tom went back to South Dakota and said the sun's shining, and they would say, easy for you to say from your, or if you say Montana's a beautiful place, somebody's sure to write in and say you can't eat scenery. Maybe you people can.
Back here on the aisle. You got time for one more, right? We have somebody on the aisle? Yep.
Hi, Tom.
Speak right up.
Hi, Tom. Just a quick question. Your earlier novels were known for their linguistic fireworks, and your later novels, post-Panama anyway, have toned down the linguistic fireworks quite a bit. And my question is, I'm a nonfiction writer, but my question is, when does language, which is our medium, both expressive, when does it get in the way?
Well, it can easily get in the way, but I think the progress of any writer who's been at it for a long time, and I've been doing this for a semi-living for 45 years, and if you look, for example, not at me, but at John Updike, you'll invariably see sort of cleaning up of language and efficiency of language, a toning down, a less inclination to leap at cleverness or surprise, and an attempt to really buckle the language down to whatever the narrative requires. And then, since we're all of us fiction writers these days seem to be children of Chekhov, who could say so much in so few words, we always feel him looming over us when we start shooting our mouths off. And I felt that more and more. But also, when I started writing, there was a much more playful era in American literature. I mean, when I think of J.P. Donlevy and Bruce J. Friedman and Joe Heller and all these places, we did a lot more fooling around on the page than anybody does anymore. We're kind of survivors now of the dirty realism era, survivors of Raymond Carver, who were all this kind of thing that really kind of changed the directions of writing in some ways, in good ways. I'd like to see it get playful again a little bit more, but I think the audience is less tolerant than it used to be.
I'll sum up with just one anecdote about the nature of our relationship. Our ranches are about 7 miles apart on a river. We're at a little higher altitude than Tom is, and our land runs a little more downhill. We have from time to time, after a heavy winter, really tough springtime flooding. And about 8 years ago now, there was really high water. And at our place, it was spilling into the ranch yard, but it wasn't getting into the house. I was back in New York. I knew that Tom and Lori were at their place. And I heard that the water was coming into the kitchen, up over the banks and across the yard and into the kitchen. And this is a trauma that you don't want to go through. So I called, being the friend, Tom, I'm in New York, and how you doing? And he said, oh, my God, you can't believe we're fighting this. And I said, well, I think we're doing a little better at our place because the water runs downhill a little faster at our place. And Tom, there was a short pause, and he said, you're a little better at your place because your ass is in New York, and I'm out here in Montana. Thank you all very much.
I want to say one last thing before we turn off. Tom and I, because we like to hunt and fish and do all these things, there have been times when we got a little bit competitive with each other. The nadir of Tom's competitiveness occurred not long ago when he turned to me and he said, my hearing aid's smaller than yours.